Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into some really foundational ideas based on the material you shared from Douglas North's big book, Institutions, Institutional Change, and Economic Performance.
Yeah, it's a landmark work, really.
Yeah.
It shifted how a lot of us think about economic performance.
Yeah.
Why do some economies take off and others just stagnate for centuries?
Exactly. And North gives us this incredible framework to understand that. So, our mission here is to unpack his main argument about these rules of the game that shape societies and, well, their economic destiny.
He puts the central question very clearly. What set of institutions actually allows people to capture the gains from trade most effectively? And, maybe more importantly, why do these institutions lead to such wildly different results across countries?
It seems simple on the surface, but the implications are huge.
Oh, absolutely.
And the source material lays out his whole analytical framework. It looks at what institutions really are, how they change over time, and what all this means for economics and history.
So if you've ever looked at, say, the U.S. and Mexico and wondered why their economic paths diverge so much, North provides some powerful tools to think about that.
Right. Get ready to look at the hidden rules that shape our world. It might challenge some assumptions.
Okay, so let's start with North's core concept. Institutions. What are they? He defines them as the humanly devised constraints that structure how we interact.
Humanly devised constraints, like rules we make up.
Pretty much. Think of them as the rules of the game for everything politics, social life, and especially the economy.
The rules of the game. Okay. But North also talks about organizations, right? How are they different?
That's a really important distinction. Institutions are the rules themselves. Organizations are the players' thinking. Businesses, political parties, universities, unions, that kind of thing.
Okay. So organizations are like the teams that play within the rules set by the institution.
Exactly. They're created to pursue opportunities defined by that institutional framework.
Makes sense. But why do we even create these rules in the first place? Why
Right.
not just interact freely?
Well, North argues it's all about uncertainty. Human interaction is inherently complex and, frankly, uncertain. Institutions are the structures we build to reduce the costs and risks of that interaction.
So they make interacting cheaper or safer than it would be otherwise.
Precisely. Compared to a world with no rules, where every interaction is a potential conflict or misunderstanding, institutions provide predictability.
And this connects back to the big puzzle. Why the huge differences in economic performance over time?
Yes, everyone agrees institutions matter, sure, but how do they matter? And why do they evolve in ways that lead some places to prosperity and others to stagnation? That's North's focus.
And a huge part of the how and why comes down to something called transaction costs.
Yes. Transaction costs. This is absolutely central to North's argument.
Okay, so what exactly are they? It's not just the cost of, like, the raw materials for a product.
No, not at all. It's the cost of everything else involved in an exchange. The cost of measuring the valuable attributes of what's being exchanged.
Like checking the quality of something.
Right. And the cost of protecting property rights, making sure what's yours stays yours. And then the cost of actually policing and enforcing the agreement itself.
Okay, so things like lawyers, contracts, banks, insurance,
Yeah.
that whole infrastructure.
Exactly. All that activity. North points to a study he did with Wallace back in '86.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that startling statistic.
It really is. They found that in the U.S. economy, over 45% of national income was devoted just to transacting.
45%. Just facilitating exchange, not actually making things.
That's right. Defining rights, protecting them, enforcing deals. And that percentage had actually increased over time. It shows how vital and costly this is.
Wow. That totally reframes the idea of production costs. It's not just the factory, it's the whole system around it.
Precisely. North insists we see total costs as both transformation costs physically making something and transaction costs defining, protecting, and enforcing the rights to it.
So why is measuring stuff so expensive? It seems simple enough.
Well, think about it. Goods, services, even how well an employee does their job. They all have tons of different attributes.
Right, like a piece of fruit, ripeness, size, blemishes.
Exactly. And measuring all those attributes perfectly for every single transaction, it's just too costly, often impossible.
And that creates problems or opportunities.
Both. Where measurement is costly or imperfect, North says it creates opportunities for wealth capture,
Meaning?
meaning one party trying to get a better deal by exploiting that information gap, like the buyer spending time picking through all the apples.
Or taking a used car to a mechanic. That's a cost incurred because you can't perfectly measure the car's condition just by looking.
Perfect examples. You're spending time or money to reduce the measurement uncertainty. This is so different from simple economic models where prices tell you everything you need to know because transacting is assumed to be free.
Right. The real world is messy.
Very messy. And transaction costs make exchange inherently imperfect.
And the other big part is enforcement, making sure people actually follow through.
Absolutely critical, especially when you're dealing with strangers or making complex agreements over time. Without good enforcement mechanisms, people have incentives to cheat or default.
Which raises uncertainty and risk.
Exactly. Historically, that uncertainty meant you needed a big risk premium, which really limited trade and economic growth. Enforcement can be simple, like personal revenge or reputation in small groups.
Or it can be more formal.
Yes, things like social norms, codes of conduct, or ultimately a coercive third party.
The state again.
We'll get there. But first, North stresses that institutions aren't just the formal laws. There's a whole other layer.
The informal constraints.
Yes. Customs, traditions, social norms, codes of conduct, these are everywhere, in every society, from the simplest to the most complex.
And North thinks these are really important, maybe even more than laws.
In many ways, yes, because they're often much harder to change deliberately. You can pass a new law tomorrow, but changing a deeply ingrained cultural norm, that takes generations, if it happens at all.
So they provide a kind of continuity, linking the past and present.
Exactly that. They're sticky. Think about how order is kept in societies without formal states, like the newer people anthropologists studied.
How does that work?
It relies on dense social networks, the credible threat of feuds. That's a kind of enforcement in informal ways to resolve disputes, like paying compensation. Because people interact repeatedly, cooperation based on reputation and the threat of future punishment makes sense. It's like iterated game theory in action.
But these informal rules aren't just ancient history, right? They matter now.
Absolutely. Think about things like credit scores. That's not strictly formal law, but it's a powerful informal mechanism reducing transaction costs in lending. Or industry standards, professional ethics, even online reviews.
Or that example North uses about ranchers in Shasta County.
Right, resolving disputes over stray cattle based on local custom, not by suing each other. It's often cheaper and more effective than formal legal channels because the informal rules are understood and accepted within that community.
And you mentioned their persistence, even after big upheavals.
Yes, that's a key insight. Revolutions, conquests, they changed the formal rules dramatically, but often the informal constraints, cultural attitudes, norms, ways of doing things persist underneath.
Like Japan after World War II, or maybe Russia after the Soviet collapse.
Those are good examples North might point to. The formal structure changes radically, but the underlying social software, the informal rules, often carries over. And this is crucial.
Why?
Because it means the exact same formal rules, like a democratic constitution, can produce completely different results when transplanted into societies with different informal constraints and cultural histories.
So the informal rules act like the operating system running underneath the applications of formal law.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
And these norms come from culture, from socially transmitted information. They shape how we even perceive the world and process information. It connects back to why we need institutions because our own information processing isn't perfect.
And what happens when you get a mismatch? Like, the formal rules change fast, but the informal ones lag behind.
That creates real tension. Friction. North sees that tension as a major engine of social and institutional change, but also a source of problems.
Okay, so we have these deep, slow-moving, informal constraints. Now let's talk about the formal ones, the laws, the constitutions.
Right. The formal constraints, written rules like constitutions, statute laws passed by legislatures, common law precedents, specific regulations, bylaws, etc.
And this is where the state becomes really central.
It does, because, as we said, for complex impersonal exchange trading with people you don't know across distances, over time, you generally need enforcement that goes beyond personal reputation or community sanctions.
You need someone with the power to compel compliance.
Exactly, a coercive third party. And there are huge economies of scale in having a single entity, the state or polity, handle the policing and enforcement of contracts and property rights. It's generally more efficient than everyone trying to enforce their own deals.
And this is a big but North is famous for.
Yes, the fundamental dilemma he quotes. If we cannot do without the state, we cannot do with it either.
Meaning the state is necessary, but also potentially dangerous.
Precisely. How do you create a state powerful enough to enforce rules impartially, but prevent that same state from using its power to simply grab wealth, predate on its citizens, or create rules that benefit the rulers at everyone else's expense.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And North models this as a kind of ongoing political bargain
A bargain between who?
between the ruler, or the ruling coalition, and the constituents, the people being governed. The rulers want revenue taxes. In exchange, they offer services like protection, justice, defining and enforcing property rights.
And things like parliaments or representative assemblies fit into this.
Yes, they often evolve as part of this bargain. Constituents demand more say over how taxes are levied and spent, seeking to constrain the ruler's power. This bargain also tends to lead to the growth of bureaucracy, needed to actually monitor economic activity and collect that revenue.
So the political rules, how the state is structured, who has power, directly shape the economic rules?
Absolutely intertwined. Constitutional rules, regulatory agencies, the structure of the courts. These political institutions define the formal economic rules that affect the cost of transacting in everything from capital markets to the housing market.
But these formal rules aren't always designed for maximum economic efficiency, are they? North calls them a mixed bag.
Exactly right. Some formal rules genuinely lower transaction costs and foster growth, think secure property rights, reliable courts. But others, created through the same political process, might raise transaction costs.
Right.
Like regulations designed to protect monopolies, barriers that restrict new businesses from entering a market, inefficient government procedures, maybe even rules that just create jobs for bureaucrats without adding value.
And this mixed bag reflects.
It reflects the underlying bargaining power of different groups in the political arena. The rules often benefit those with the most influence, not necessarily society as a whole.
Okay, so we have these formal and informal rules shaped by politics and history. How do they actually change over time? Does it happen quickly?
Mostly, no. North strongly emphasizes that institutional change is typically incremental. It's a slow, gradual evolution. Think about the centuries it took for feudalism to fade away in Europe.
So, not usually big bangs like revolutions.
Revolutions happen, sure. But North argues even they are never completely discontinuous. Those deeply embedded informal constraints, the cultural norms, they often persist and shape what comes after the revolution. The past still casts a long shadow.
And what's the engine driving this gradual change?
It's the constant interaction between the institutions, the rules, and the organizations, the players. Remember, institutions define the opportunities available.
Right, and organizations pop up to take advantage of those opportunities.
Exactly. And as these organizations compete, innovate, and pursue their goals within the existing rules, their actions start to subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, push against the boundaries. They might find loopholes, lobby for changes, or develop new ways of operating that incrementally alter the institutional structure itself.
So the players end up changing the rules of the game just by playing it.
That's a good way to put it. It's a dynamic feedback loop.
And this leads us to another really core concept for North, path dependence.
Yes. Crucial idea. Path dependence basically means that history matters. A lot. Where you end up institutionally is heavily influenced by the path you took to get there.
You mentioned the QWERTY keyboard analogy earlier.
Right, that's a classic example from technology, often associated with Brian Arthur, whose work North draws on. The idea is that technologies, and North argues institutions too, can exhibit increasing returns.
Increasing returns, what does that mean in this context?
It means the more prevalent an institution becomes, the greater the benefits of sticking with it. This can happen for several reasons. There are often large initial setup costs for new rules or systems. Organizations and individuals get better at operating within the existing rules through learning by doing. Coordination benefits arise because it's easier if everyone uses the same standards. And finally, adaptive expectations kick in. People gain confidence that the rules won't suddenly change, making them more willing to invest based on those rules.
And all these factors together create a kind of lock-in.
Precisely. Small, maybe even accidental historical events or choices made early on can get reinforced and amplified over time, making it incredibly costly and difficult to switch to a different institutional path, even if that alternative path might theoretically be better or more efficient.
So once you're on a path, you're kind of stuck on it. Is it inevitable?
North is careful here. He says it's not inevitability or determinism. Choices are always being made. But the crucial point is that the choices made in the past shape and constrain the choices available today. The historical path narrows the feasible options and links decisions across time.
And this is why societies can get stuck on paths that aren't very productive.
Exactly. If the initial set of institutions, maybe due to historical accident or conquest, creates incentives and payoffs that reward unproductive activities, Think piracy, warfare, rent-seeking through political connections, simple redistribution rather than wealth creation.
Then organizations will form to pursue those activities.
Right. And because of increasing returns, these organizations become more effective and powerful over time. They develop a vested interest in maintaining the existing unproductive rules.
And they use their power to influence politics and keep those rules in place.
That's the trap. They shape the polity, the political rules to protect their interests, which reinforces the unproductive institutional path. It becomes self-perpetuating.
And North even argues our beliefs adapt to this.
Yes, that's a fascinating part. He suggests that the subjective mental models, the ideologies, the shared stories people tell themselves about their society tend to evolve to rationalize and justify the existing structure, even if it's objectively performing poorly. The beliefs support the path.
Can we look at some concrete historical examples North uses to illustrate this?
Definitely. A major one is the contrast between the development paths of North America, specifically the U.S., and Latin America.
Starting from colonial times.
Yes. The argument is that the initial institutional frameworks inherited from the colonizing powers set them on divergent paths. The English colonies in North America, despite many flaws like slavery, inherited institutions that generally provided more secure property rights, more decentralized political power, and fostered norms encouraging commerce and individual initiative, relatively speaking.
And this framework encouraged productive organizations.
It did. It created payoffs for activities like farming, trade, and later industry. Even specific policies like the Northwest Ordinance created a predictable, path-dependent way for the country to expand, defining property rights and political rules in new territories.
Okay, and how did that contrast with Latin America?
The Spanish and Portuguese colonial models were fundamentally different. They were highly centralized, bureaucratic, and focused primarily on extracting resources and revenue for the crown back in Europe. This often involved monopolies, heavy taxation, and less secure property rights for the broader population.
So a different set of incentives from the start.
A very different set. And critically, even after independence, when many Latin American countries adopted formal constitutions that looked similar to the U.S. one.
The results weren't the same.
Not at all. Because, North argues, those formal rules were being grafted onto a completely different underlying institutional matrix. Different informal norms, different organizational structures, different historical experiences, and different subjective beliefs shaped by that history. The path dependence was powerful.
He also contrasts England and Spain, right, around the 17th century.
Yes, another great example. Both kingdoms faced similar problems, needing more government revenue, often to finance wars, but they took very different institutional paths to solve that problem.
England had the whole struggle between the crown and parliament.
Right, which ultimately led to Parliament gaining significant control over finances, the establishment of the Bank of England, a more credible commitment to repaying debt, and generally more secure property rights. This path fostered the development of deep capital markets and laid the groundwork for sustained economic growth.
While in Spain,
Spain's monarchy struggled with recurring fiscal crises, frequently defaulted on debts, confiscated private wealth, and failed to establish similarly secure property rights. This created uncertainty and hampered long-term investment and economic dynamism, leading to relative decline.
And North suggests it wasn't just about Parliament winning in England.
He suggests that the formal changes, like Parliament's rise, were likely successful, in part because the underlying informal constraints in England, maybe prevailing social attitudes, norms about contracts, respect for law, were more compatible with or hospitable to those formal changes compared to Spain. The soil was more fertile for those particular seeds.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. Institutions, transaction costs, formal versus informal, path dependence. What's the big picture takeaway for understanding economic performance?
The fundamental takeaway is that institutions are the critical factor explaining long-run differences in economic performance. They are not just passive background elements, they actively shape the incentives.
They determine the payoffs for doing different things.
Exactly. Institutions set the rules that determine whether it's more profitable in a society to engage in productive activities like innovation, investment, trade, or in unproductive activities like rent-seeking, exploiting monopolies, fighting over existing wealth.
So poor countries are poor not because of lack of resources or effort, but because their institutions don't incentivize productive behavior.
That's the core of North's argument. Similarly, he'd argue that the failures of socialist economies stemmed fundamentally from their institutional frameworks, which created perverse incentives regarding information, effort, and innovation.
And in this view, markets aren't inherently perfect or efficient.
No, because the institutions that underpin markets are themselves the product of history and political bargaining, making them that mixed bag we talked about. Even in well-functioning market economies, there will always be incentives to cheat, shirk, or free ride, because creating perfect institutions that align all incentives perfectly is basically impossible, especially for complex exchanges.
So, historical success isn't about achieving some theoretical ideal, but about finding practical institutional innovations that lower key transaction costs.
Precisely. Think about the challenges of long-distance trade in the Middle Ages. It was incredibly risky. Success required developing a whole suite of institutional solutions.
Like what?
Things like standardized weights and measures, reliable money, notary services to verify documents, merchant law courts to settle disputes, enforcement mechanisms like codes of conduct, or even ostracism from the merchant community, financial instruments like the bill of exchange, better accounting methods to track things, ways to monitor agents acting on your behalf far away.
Wow, a whole ecosystem of rules and practices.
Exactly. These weren't random developments. They were specific institutional innovations that reduced the massive uncertainty and transaction costs involved, making that kind of trade possible and profitable, which in turn expanded markets and spurred growth.
And understanding all this requires economists to maybe rethink some basic assumptions, like about perfect rationality or information.
North certainly pushes in that direction. He argues that standard economic models often assume actors have perfect information, know the correct model of the world, and are driven solely by maximizing wealth. But to understand why institutions exist and how they work, you have to consider subjective perceptions, incomplete information, the role of ideology, and more complex human motivations.
Our beliefs and how we see the world are part of the story.
A crucial part. It's a feedback loop. Institutions shape our beliefs, and our beliefs influence how institutions evolve.
And this helps explain why we see continued divergence between economies, even in a globalized world.
Yes, you might expect globalization and falling information costs to lead to convergence, as standard theory might predict. But North argues that the forces of institutional increasing returns and path dependence are so strong that they can maintain divergence, keeping societies locked onto very different long-term trajectories based on their unique histories.
So bringing this back to us, to you listening, how can we use this perspective today?
I think it gives you a really powerful lens for analyzing almost any economic or social issue. When you look at a particular market, or a country's overall performance, or a specific policy debate, ask, what are the underlying rules of the game here?
Both the written laws and the unwritten norms.
Absolutely. Who enforces them? What behavior do they actually incentivize? Are they lowering the costs of productive interaction, or are they perhaps raising them, maybe to benefit certain groups?
And remembering that institutions are often that mixed bag is useful.
Definitely. It stops you from thinking in simplistic terms. Even in an economy we consider relatively efficient, like the U.S., you'll find rules that clearly help markets function smoothly alongside others that seem to gum up the works. Understanding why both exist usually takes you back to history and politics.
It also makes you think about where talent and effort are flowing in a society.
Right. What kind of knowledge and skills does the institutional framework make it most profitable to acquire? Is it skills in engineering, science, and efficient production? Or is it skills in navigating bureaucracy, lobbying politicians, or finding ways to extract rents without creating value? The institutions shape those payoffs profoundly.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground, really digging into Douglas North's framework. We've defined institutions as these crucial formal and informal rules, explored why transaction costs are so central, seen how these rules evolve incrementally and are subject to path dependence, and ultimately how this explains the huge differences in economic outcomes across history and around the world today.
It really forces you to see economics as deeply embedded within a society's history, politics, and culture. It's not just about supply and demand curves in isolation.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something North touches on that really makes you think. He argues that our subjective beliefs, our ideologies, they actually evolve to rationalize the institutional structure we live in.
Yeah, even if that structure isn't working very well for most people, the collective story, the shared understanding of how things are and why they are that way, tends to adapt to justify the existing path.
So consider this. How might the deeply ingrained beliefs, the unquestioned norms, the cultural narratives in any society you look at, maybe even your own, be subtly reinforcing the current institutional path, making real fundamental change incredibly difficult no matter what new laws get written on paper?
That historical path and the beliefs that support it can be a powerful constraint, something to definitely reflect on.